Oh, yeah. Hello, and welcome back to The Distillery, a casual interview series. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. Today we have special guest, Melissa McGlensey. Hey, Melissa, how are you doing?
I'm great. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Melissa is an improv comedian and also a writer, and I'm really curious as to how you got your start in comedy.
Improv was a gateway drug of sorts for me. It all started with improv and then snowballed from there, basically.
How did you even get involved in what that is?
So I got involved with improv through UCB, the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater in Los Angeles, which is a theater known most notably because Amy Poehler was one of the founders, one of the four founding members of it. And I was living in LA at the time, fresh out of college, working at a magazine, kind of like, not sure what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And a friend of mine said, "You should take an improv class." I think what he actually told me was everyone in his improv classes reminded him of me, which, like,
Okay.
I don't know if that's a compliment. In fact, it's definitely not a compliment now that I think about it. But yeah, I was feeling really like at sea. I was living in the South Bay after moving from Eugene, Oregon. So I was surrounded by a bunch of people who weren't like me or interested in things I was interested in. So I joined up as a means to like have something to do on weekends and meet friends. And at the end of the first class, I was like, oh, this is my life now. I was just hooked.
What was it that really appealed to you or attracted you to that?
I think improv just plays straight into all of my skill sets. Um, and it feels good to be good at something. And I think, even though a level one class is not very intensive, I was just like, I could be good at this and I love it and I want to do it always forever. Now, some of that fervor has worn off over the like 7 or 8 years since then, but I think deep down I still feel similarly.
That's really great, and something quite, I think, recognizable in a lot of people's passions, where they've dived into something that's a bit niche and then discovered that it's their life. Um,
Mhm.
and even though some of the sheen might wear away, there's always something at the core of it that excites you, no matter what.
Yeah. And for
Um,
me with improv, that thing is connection, human connection, collaboration. Um, Performance is fun too, but at its core, it's really about like connecting with the people you are on stage with at that time.
that is something incredible. I mean, I think improv gets a weird rep. Um, like people joke about it, like, "Oh, improv, haha, I'd
Mhm.
rather whatever." Um, but having seen improv and now seeing like their improv specials on comedy, like Middleditch and Schwartz and other places that you
Mhm.
can kind of see it online, as a format and particularly genre improv, people can see the craft and the skill of that on stage connection, which is really something special and unique.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm wondering, can you talk us through, I guess, like what improv actually is as its own art form compared to non-improvised comedy?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's another thing that draws me to improv is like it's not totally amorphous, but there is like an ephemeral quality to it. And I think that's one of the reasons it really sucked me in to begin with. But at its core, it is performing scenes unscripted. I guess to get even more specific, I'm talking about long form improv, which is the kind of improv I primarily do. Short form improv, most famous for the show Whose Line Is It Anyways, or comedy, also known as theater sports or comedy sports, is slightly different. They have the same backbone, but their comedy sports or short form improv has like external structures imposed upon it that the players are hitting up against. For example, one of you is secretly a zebra. That's a terrible example, but you know what I mean. Or
Sure.
like,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I'm sure that's happened in Whose Line.
yeah,
So
exactly. There's external limitations, like you can only say so many words, or when a bell rings, this happens, etc. Long form, the limitations of the world we create, we set ourselves because we are creating it. So we still find like repeatable patterns of behavior, but we define them and execute them at the same time on our own.
it
Um,
seems incredibly meta. Like there's constant analysis of storytelling and structure.
yes, which is what I love. I love it so much, especially in narrative long form, which is another offshoot, one that I'm really passionate about. Narrative long form is all about story structure. The other form of long form, most notably the Herald, is a structure, a type of long form improv that is non narrative, meaning it's not plot based. And that is not quite so much story structure, but it's about understanding beats, understanding human behavior, things like that.
So in a long form comedy, whether I mean, maybe we can focus on narrative genre
Mhm.
improv because that is your specialty. What makes it? What makes for a really good story in the setting of this improv?
Ooh, it depends. A couple things. I think you are always going to get better, more interesting, more daring stories out of a troupe that is very familiar with each other, because one of the core things powering good ensemble work in improv is trust. For example, I'm involved with a troupe, an ensemble here in Melbourne that does improvised Shakespeare. We're Soothplayers, and we've been together for I think they're going on like 5 years. I've been involved with them for about 3 of those. So we have a level of trust there that is just implicit. I know if I go out on a limb, they're going to support me, they're going to make my ideas look good, and they're going to find a way to piece it together. So trust is really important because that allows you to make surprising choices. Because at the end of the day, that's the most fun, is when a choice surprises not only yourself, a choice I've just made surprises me, but surprises my players and my colleagues. Some of the most fun we ever have on stage is when we are like stimulating and surprising each other. For example, like these are bad examples, but they'll give you an idea. Like if I know a particular player is really bad at Scottish accents, and on stage I endow them as some Scottish king on purpose. That's the kind of like meta interplay you can have when you're really comfortable with each other. Or like, we'll make each other sing if we know someone doesn't like to sing on stage, and it becomes this like sub game of subverting that, but knowing that ultimately you will have to honor that as well.
It feels like it adds another layer of human drama when watching these stories unfold.
Yeah.
Like you're keeping track of these characters, but you're also keeping track of the performers as
Yes.
their own characters.
And you mentioned Middleditch and Schwartz. I think you really see that kind of improv with Middleditch and Schwartz as compared to, for example, the other famous duo is TJ and Dave. And when you see TJ and Dave play, they lean away from that kind of meta play. They're both professional actors. I mean, so are Middleditch and Schwartz, but they play like really true to the characters. Whereas Middleditch and Schwartz wear their characters as a very light veil that they like to like pull up and laugh at one another with. And I think both kinds are really fun. I've sort of leaned towards the thin veil approach, and I have a theory about it. And I have colleagues who disagree. Some are like, would rather see much more commitment.
Yeah, give us the hot take.
Well, okay, for me, I think if you want to see like intense commitment, serious acting chops, those are all like laudable things and things maybe you go to the theater to see. I don't think you go to improv to see that. I think they're bonuses, but I think seeing the play between the people on stage is like what makes improv joyous. Some improvisers would say like the greatest compliment you can get after a show is someone comes up to you and they just like can't believe it was scripted, which happens to us occasionally. Someone will come up and be like, oh, come on, you talked about that backstage, or you wrote that, or you knew this was going to happen. And that's not true. We never do. But some people take that as the highest form of compliment, but I actually don't. I think you can play with each other as performers while still honoring the characters, and that can be really fun as well. Here's a small example. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, go for it.
So recently, Soothplayers did a season at Adelaide Fringe, and we're such a close, tight-knit troupe that we made a little like bet. So oftentimes, because it's Shakespeare, we'll be forced to like kiss on stage or do things like that. But when we kiss on stage, I think it's funny, and so I started a kiss count. And at the end of the season, which was like 7 shows or whatever, whoever initiated the most onstage kisses was going to be the winner. And so the very last game, or so, a couple shows, I would be playing with fellow performers who I knew were like getting high in the kiss count. So I would like intentionally block their kisses by running into a scene and interrupting, or I would like kiss other players, etc. And then the very last show of the festival, I was taking notes. I wasn't performing in, and the 2 people playing intentionally kissed in every single scene just to knock me out of the kiss count. It's very fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is like a metagame that the audience is not really aware of, but the effect is very much seen and felt.
And they're not aware of it, but at some level they are, because they know that there's this game of excessive kissing happening between these characters. So they're not totally in the dark, but yeah, they didn't know that I was in the audience like squirming, like, no.
I'm really curious, over and over again, we're using the language of games, play, and even sports, like theater sports.
Mm-hmm.
What does the world of playfulness offer? Because it feels like you're offering this perspective of improv where people are watching the well-played game of like people playing together.
Yeah.
So yeah, how does playfulness actually impact both improv and your perspective on humor?
Playfulness is everything. You can just tell when you get on stage with someone you're really comfortable with and you look in their eyes and you're like, let's go. It is almost sports-like. It has this feeling of like, let's spar, you and I, or I'm going to lob this up. Are you going to catch it? Or are you going to dodge it? Or are you going to feint and then catch it? It's intellectual sport. Not to say that sport isn't intellectual, but
Murder.
Yeah.
Sports all.
Exactly. But it's very playful. Now, you bring up a controversial subject in improv, which is the concept of game.
Ooh.
It can be a dirty word, I think, not rightfully so. In improv, it speaks to a very specific kind of improv, which again is long form, which is my background. UCB coined this term, the game of the scene, to talk about how to create scenes that have this like comedic wheel that they turn on, or comedic vehicle. Blah, blah, blah. All game in a scene means is a repeatable pattern of abnormal human behavior. So like a very simple example is like some famous SNL sketch called, I think it's like Werewolf Lawyer. And the game of that scene is just, he's doing lawyer things, but he's a werewolf. So it's just a way to like notice a pattern of behavior that other players, once they recognize, oh, the game is lawyer thing, werewolf thing. And then they can chime in and play, because they'll be like, oh, lawyer thing, it's time for a werewolf thing.
Right. So the game is like a set of rules. I mean, this is now just definitions of games in some game studies circles, but like a set of rules that people can latch onto and have a shared reality with.
Yeah, the shared reality exists whether there's game or not in the scene. People call them game scenes. The game scene is specifically like, are we repeating one specific pattern of behavior here?
Right.
Like rather than being like, I'm a werewolf doctor and I'm a vampire lawyer, we're just playing the game of werewolf lawyer, etc. It gets a bad rap because there's people who prefer to play things more narrative, more quote unquote organically. Oh boy, we could really get in the weeds of the terminology, but I won't do that to you.
Thanks. I mean, it feels like any invested community, there's a lot of argument and positive discussion about like what constitutes the really good quality stuff, and it's going to lead to refined taste and different spin-off of that.
Exactly.
What about the other side of the coin, which is bad stuff, like when stuff goes wrong? Do you have like different categories of what going wrong could mean, and how do you deal with it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's infinite ways for things to go wrong. And that's why we practice. When people hear improv and then they hear rehearsals or practice, they're like, how do you practice it if you don't know what's going to happen? But that's like saying, why do you go to football practice when you could just memorize a choreography? That analogy fell apart. My point.
No, I think it's valid. Like training, right? You're training the skills.
You're training your skills, and then you bring those skills to whatever happens in that moment. So, like for example, I'm the director of Melbourne's Improvised Potter troupe, which is like an offshoot of the Soothplayers organization we talked about earlier. And we practice like what happens if Voldemort gets killed off? How do you finish the show? What happens if, Harry accidentally is immobilized and Hermione has to win the day? It's all about like playing different scenarios and how we cope with those scenarios based on the like skills we've developed. In terms of things going bad, it's a live audience. It is a form that depends on a live audience. So, some of our funniest stories are when audience members get a little rowdy, have had too much to drink, want to participate more than we want them to. These are all things that are risks you take when you step on stage. But, our improvisers are like trained and ready for these moments.
And what about, you're playing with fire in the sense that it's all live and unscripted. Are there moments where you collectively go, that was too far?
Yeah.
And how do you deal with that if that's what happens?
I haven't personally had one of those moments in a long time outside of a rehearsal room, but it's really complex because we are asking performers to literally say things without processing them first. That's part of it. That's part of it is getting comfortable in spontaneity, getting comfortable in the unknown and learning to trust yourself and your instincts. And they're not always right. Sometimes you say something you didn't intend to be construed in the way that it is very obviously construed. Or sometimes, an action is taken by another player in a direction you didn't want it to. I luckily haven't had any of those moments on stage in quite a long time. But when they happen, you can cope with them in a variety of ways. One way is to call it out in character. Another way is to do the best you can in the moment and then talk to your teammates later about how you can like improve upon that and not fall into that trap. But yeah, I think especially when I teach improv, I teach my students like there's this idea in improv, the whole yes and, right? Everyone knows yes and, you have to say yes. Oftentimes you can say yes by saying no, and oftentimes that's what you need to do. For example, if we're in a scene and I'm like, hey, let's jump off this cliff, I don't actually want you to say yeah and jump because then the scene is over. So like the best way for you to say yes to that initiation is to say no. What we mean when we say yes means don't say, that's not a cliff, that's your grandma, right? Like it happens more often than I want to admit. But
Oh,
that's what
no.
we mean by saying yes. You're saying yes to the reality, not to the like action I'm demanding of you. So you can say, yes, that's a cliff, and no, I'm not going to jump off of it. And then we have a
Right. So
scene.
you're still validating the narrative being told, or the proposition,
Exactly. Yeah.
while advancing it in a different direction.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another thing I love about playing with Soothplayers is we're so comfortable with one another. We know each other's limits. And before each show, and I do this with Potter too, we talk about our physical limits and our emotional limits for that day. Like we might be like, hey, I'm having a tough day. I don't want to be in any fights, like literal on stage fights, or like my shoulder's kind of sore, don't touch me there, or like I'm feeling a little sick, no kissing tonight for me. And we go around the circle as part of our warm-ups and we say where we're at so that we know. I think that's important. I think too, we don't find ourselves in situations in dicey territory often because we have shared values as a company. And that's one of the things I love about doing Shakespeare specifically is I like to say we're not just doing Shakespeare improvised, we're doing Shakespeare revised because a lot of Shakespeare's values don't align with ours nowadays. So we're kind of like updating it in a modern way. So we make a point of like, if our female character doesn't want to get married, she doesn't have to by the end of the play. Or, you know, we have gay characters or other things that like wouldn't have existed on stage in Shakespeare's era. It helps us stay out of dicey territory.
I would like to kind of ask about the values and politics of comedy next, but maybe I can take a meta moment, recognizing that I'm playing a role of an interviewer and you of an interviewee, that we are trying to create a connection. And earlier, I very off the cuff kind of made this like herder sports ball comment, and now calling myself out in character as the this isn't quite working, but you get the point. Like, oh, that was maybe a bit ableist of me. You know, rooted in some sort of this is the imagining of what we make fun of, that's related to ableism on the axis of intellectual disability. So I guess this relates then to my next question of like, okay, the values that we profess as human beings are not always the same values that we actually want to hold or have, and they can leak out of us in unexpected ways. We're seeing that more broadly, I think, with you know, people starting to understand the ways that moving through privilege and benefiting from systems of racism, you know, affects our everyday lives, not just in our, you know, oh, is this action racist or not racist? It's like, it's more of that, the medium through which we swim. So I guess I'm tying all of these considerations together to ask, how does comedy relate to values? You said that it's easier because everyone has the same values. Is comedy something that is designed to be political? And yeah, like when people go to a show, are they actually wanting to have a dialogue about society?
Oh, I
Or is it
don't
just fun
know.
games?
I don't know the answer to that last one. It's been a long time since I went to a show not as a comedian, so it's hard for me to imagine like what people want when they step into that room as an audience member. But I think the answer is comedy maybe isn't necessarily inherently political, but I think at its best it is, and that's just my personal preference. I mean, you know this about me. You've been to my shows before, but
Yeah, I
I'm
wanted
very
to mention the briefing at some point as well.
Oh, yeah, so The Briefing is my solo show where I improvise as, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the former White House press secretary, and take questions from, you know, I treat the audience as a press corps and take questions. And so to me, comedy is this like incredible opportunity to strike at unjust systems of power and to express opinions, but I don't think it has to be. And especially when it comes to improv, it's so much harder. You know, like in The Briefing, it's partly scripted, not the part where I take questions, obviously, but I think when you're asking people to be political on stage as improvisers with no script, to get the words out perfectly, to not accidentally imply things that don't align with their values. That's a big ask. And keep in mind, their heads are full with, just trying to keep the scene going and say words, etc. So I think it's a big ask for improv, for pure improv, to also be political. It can be, and it often is when I'm performing it, but I think it's a big ask to demand that. I think that's part of the reasons why I started stepping away from pure improv and doing like partial sketch, partial scripted, some stand-up, because that's easier to like coalesce your ideas and express them coherently. But yeah, it's just my preference that comedy be political, because otherwise, what are you doing? It's just like boring to me. It's like, haha, it's funny, but what are you saying with it?
And even, you mentioning things like you're revising Shakespeare itself is a political action.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in theory, even just having women and people of color and gender nonconforming and people all over the sexual spectrum on stage is doing Shakespeare is political, because they would have never been allowed near a stage in Elizabethan England.
I'm so curious to ask a little bit more about Completely Improvised Potter. Because I went to the stage show and you are the director of that. Can you tell us what functionally directing an improv show actually means?
Yeah, of course. It means a lot of things. In my case, I inherited the show. I was not the original director. That was Andrew Strano. In fact, the show you came to was one of the last ones I performed in. That was Comedy Festival 2019, before I took over the directorship. But because it's a thing that I inherited and didn't create myself, I do a lot of like maintaining our shared vision, improving, tweaking here and there. But I wasn't I didn't birth this. That was Strano and our producers, Adam Hembry and Ryan Patterson. But I brought on new people. I organize rehearsals. We keep up to date on our Potter trivia, etc. And a large thing I've noticed since directing this company is I spend a lot of my time just reminding my players what they're capable of, because they're a part of the troupe because they're talented and funny and witty. And so I spend a lot of time in rehearsal just being like, hey, remember how good you are at this? Do that again. Yeah, I think I'm just really lucky. I'm lucky that they don't need that much. They just need to shake the dust off. Because unlike Improvised Shakespeare, we don't rehearse year round. Potter, we only come back together for festivals and one-off shows, etc. So I spend a lot of time just, talking about story structure. Like, at what point in our arc does our hero need to start losing? At what point do they need to start winning? Remember your skills, etc.
I think that's a really great encouragement. I feel like we need more support of each other's abilities and skills just in everyday life situations.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we got this. We can do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Melissa, thank you so much for chatting with me about improvisation and comedy. There's so much that we could dive into, but we've unfortunately got to close up the interview.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Everyone go take an improv class if you feel so inclined, because they're wonderful.
That is a very good provocation. I would really like to do that.
You should. You would be great at it.
I don't know about that, but I'm sure I would enjoy it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Take care, Melissa. You're watching The Distillery, a series of online interviews. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. You can check out previous interviews on our website, distillery.site, and also look at the upcoming guests. And check out our Instagram at distillery.site and get informed on Twitter at distillery-site. And we'll be back again tomorrow with a new episode, so do tune in. Until then, take care.